Hello? All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Oh, thank you. My name is Cheryl Russell, and I'm the Executive Director of Corporate Foundation Government and Civic Affairs for the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to the school's third annual Citizen Artist Forum. The School Citizen Artist Forum provides a platform for artists, designers, and others to engage in a timely, relevant conversation about topics that we all face as a society. Each year, the School of the Art Institute works with strategic partners to craft an engaging conversation. And for tonight's discussion about the First Amendment, we are really honored to be working with the American and the Illinois Library Associations to make this happen. On tonight's stage, we will have an accomplished panel featuring experts from various disciplines, which include a representative from a part of the state that I still call home, Southern Illinois. More specifically, yay. I know, right, Joe? Yay. More specifically, I am from Tams, Illinois, home of Egyptian High School, which is one of a number of Southern Illinois high schools that are part of a statewide outreach effort we are doing in partnership with the Illinois Arts Education Association. So, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Alyssa Tinney, President of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago.
Thanks, Cheryl, and thank you for your outstanding work in putting together this evening. And thank you all for being here tonight in the Cindy Pritzker Auditorium of the Harold Washington Library, where we physically are, and in the locations throughout Illinois where today's discussion is being simulcast. As is appropriate in any discussion of our civil liberties, oh my goodness gracious. Somebody told me that when that happens to me, I should go, so I'm doing that. But I'll start again. As is appropriate to any discussion of our civil liberties, which are freedoms we negotiate together, it has taken a lot of individuals working together to make tonight happen. So in addition to our presenters and panelists, I want to thank a number of people in my brief remarks. But right at the top, I want to acknowledge a number of elected representatives here tonight, both in the room and watching via simulcast, who are well accustomed to important debate in their work representing Illinois residents in Springfield. Representative Patrick Windhorse, who is viewing tonight's event from Shawnee Community College, Representative Dave Severin, who is viewing tonight's event from Southern Illinois University's Gaon Auditorium, and Representative Will Grizzardi, who is here in Chicago, right in the front row. Thank you so much for your work on behalf of Illinois residents and your support of tonight's discussion. I'd also like to thank Shawnee Community College, Southern Illinois University, and the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum for hosting the simulcast, so the cities of Carbondale, Ulen, and Springfield can be part of the audience tonight. I hope this widely viewed conversation inspires individuals throughout our great state to continue to reflect, debate, and maybe even make some art inspired by the freedoms we value. Tonight, we will be considering 5 of those freedoms enshrined in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution that ought to be guaranteed not just to Americans, but to everyone. As the framers famously wrote in the Declaration of Independence, these rights are certain and inalienable. They are religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. Of course, as we will discover through our distinguished panelists' exploration of some of these First Amendment guarantees, negotiating everyone's freedoms in a shared society, to put it actually diplomatically, is a nuanced endeavor. Living together as a community of free individuals takes personal conviction, integrity, and honesty. It also takes compromise, patience, forgiveness, and love. It is the very definition of citizenship. At the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, we also believe that making art is an act of citizenship. We count on artists and designers to be radically free in their vision and craft, helping us imagine a future that we can't yet see. This is why the ability to express oneself freely is so central to the work of the artist and so relevant to our discussion tonight. Nevertheless, artists and designers are citizens too, who don't create in a vacuum. Their work is shaped by and helps to shape the larger world we are part of. This means that artists have the same responsibility as every citizen does, to use their talents to make our shared society better, more richly imagined, more fair, more compassionate, more livable. At SAIC, we call this being a citizen artist. It means recognizing our interconnectedness as people, for it is both certain and inalienable that we are all citizens of a common humanity. And to make sure we are pursuing the best society we can imagine, we must periodically question it together. When I think of the best society we have, I know it possesses libraries, of course, alongside art and design. In addition to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum and the Harold Washington Library, the Library Associations of Illinois and America have been fantastic partners on this project. Throughout history and throughout our state, libraries have always been bastions of free expression, connecting communities to the history of human thought and ideas. I want to recognize Richard Long, director of the Skokie Library, who is also here tonight. The Skokie Library's programming, including a commitment to civic engagement and art exhibition, is an exemplar of the great work libraries do throughout our state. And last, but certainly not least, it is my great pleasure to introduce another great library professional, Commissioner for Chicago Public Libraries, Andrea Telly, who has a few words.
Thank you, Elisa. Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrea Telly, and I'm Commissioner of the Chicago Public Library. I'd like to thank the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, the library systems, and our association partners who have joined us tonight for this program. Today, when information and content are more prolific than ever, giving people the ability and the tools to learn and discover is key to maintaining truth and equality. I believe libraries are at the forefront of these ideas. Patrons come at the library to do so much more than just to check out books. They register for health care, they educate themselves on local elections, they vote, they find employment, they advance their educations, they find a warm or a cool place to stay for the day, they read, and they dream. This week, Chicago Public Library announced an end to overdue fines for all patrons. So bring your libraries, bring your books back. Yay! To some, this might seem like a minor decision that frees our staff from collecting quarters from patrons with late books. However, for many people in Chicago and across the country, fines and fees are a serious barrier to library access and, by extension, to free information and expression. When 1 in 5 children under the age of 14 cannot check out books because of fines, how can we expect curious youth to learn, grow, and become educated citizens of the world? I believe an educated and knowledgeable city is one that offers its residents the opportunity to succeed in anything, no matter their age, educational attainment, or certainly their ability to pay an overdue fine for a book that may have changed their life. As commissioner of the library system here, I'm so thankful for the opportunity to host programs like More Speech that advance important discussions about how to extend access and equity of information to everyone. We are so grateful to be part of these ongoing conversations and exchanges of information, and are excited to see how the library community continues to lead on these issues in the future. It is now my pleasure to welcome David Hiller, President of the McCormick Foundation, who will tell you a little more about what More Speech means and why it's so important.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you particularly for hosting us in this magnificent library. And it's also wonderful to be connected virtually to our colleagues in libraries all across Illinois. And when you think about it, there's no more fitting place to have a conversation like this than a library. This library and all the others in our city and state embody the real fundamental values of inquiry and expression that the First Amendment protects. And I also want to thank the School of the Art Institute for organizing this program, and I love their centerpiece idea of the artist as citizen. It's certainly the case that creative expression informs our civic lives in many, many ways, both through the direct expression of ideas and political viewpoints, which are important and can be controversial and stir people up, which is often what they should do, but also through giving all of us the possibility of expanding our creative imaginations. So as was mentioned, as Alyssa mentioned, so we can picture things that we haven't seen and maybe cross differences with greater empathy that we haven't known before. So I'm really thrilled to be part of this. We've got a very distinguished panel here, which are mostly friends and colleagues and partners of me and the foundation, so I'm not going to delay us long in getting to them. But with the feast that we're anticipating for them, if you'll forgive me, I'll briefly set the table for them. The title of our program, More Speech, is intriguing and provocative. And I think many of us here and in other audiences would say, why do we need more speech? I almost can't imagine having more text, more tweets, more podcasts, more Netflix movies, more of Facebook posts than we can already have trouble dealing with. And indeed, when people are asked, they say, I'm overwhelmed already. I don't know how to navigate this great sea of information that's coming my way. And in an area that's of specific interest to myself with my background in the newspaper business, when you ask Americans about the news media, there's good news and bad news, like a lot of things. The good news is in fact, overwhelming numbers of Americans say that an independent and vigorous news media is critical to our democracy. But then when you probe them and ask, well, how's our news media doing? The bad news is they don't think we're doing all that well. Only 28% say that journalists and news media are doing a good or very good job. More than 2/3 of Americans say the news media is biased, and less than half say they can name an objective news source. And it may surprise you what they say. The top two objective news sources they mentioned were Fox News and CNN. Now, nearly everybody, 88%, think fake news is a serious threat to our democracy. And we'll talk more about that tonight. But if you'll allow me a personal note, and speaking of fake news, I also think it's a threat to our democracy when the President of the United States runs around demonizing legitimate journalists and news simply because he dislikes how they're reporting on them. And it's corrosive enough in our country where we've still got strong civic institutions and strong press, but it's way worse in other countries where they're ruled by autocrats, have civic institutions that aren't as strong and press that's not as free, and that kind of language allows those autocrats cover when they're out trying to silence or imprison, intimidate, or worse, the press that they fear. So the classic answer, as the program title suggests, if you're dealing with false news or offensive speech, is more speech. Let the marketplace of ideas, as Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes coined the metaphor, control. And whatever you do in that marketplace, don't let the government get involved in sorting out good speech from bad speech and good speakers from bad speakers. But it's very interesting. Today, there's no clear consensus that that's still the way we ought to run the marketplace of ideas. Consider, as I know the panel will get into later, the issue of hate speech or fake news on social media. Now, the law here is still in the United States that the government can't regulate that. But as you may know, it's very different in Europe, where the government gets heavily involved in the regulation of offensive speech of different sorts. And you'll find people arguing that that's a far better model, or a better model than our more permissive, more protective framework here. But then you get into, well, what about the people who own and run the social media platforms? And here is interesting. For many years, Facebook and Twitter and all those said, hey, that's not our responsibility. It's not our business. We're not publishers. That's not our content. We're the pipes or the transmission. And but what we've seen in recent years in response to the outrage resulting from the Russian fake news and other fake news and hate speech on the internet, they've changed. And now if you follow, Facebook has like 20,000 people that they employ to be monitoring or trying to monitor everything that's on their platform to try to screen out hate speech and fake news and fake websites and you know, and that's a very hard job, even if they could, you know, as many people as they could apply to do it. But more fundamentally, while that may be the right answer, in a lot of ways, I'm not sure you can get totally comfortable with the idea that Mark Zuckerberg or other people who are in the private sphere and own these platforms are going to be the censors of what goes on in the marketplace of ideas. And I know our panel have views on that. But I thought, rather than all the doom and gloom, I will tell you where I see a few ways that we can work on together to help this. The first is, starting with all of us, in all the ways we can think of, we all need to try to be good citizens, even better citizens, and encourage our friends and family to do that. And that means being responsible for what we read, what we believe, what we think, what we tweet, what we communicate to other people, because we all play a part in this marketplace of ideas, and being responsible about that, I think, can and does, and I'm sure with you it already does, start with us. Because frankly, although the technology of social media and certainly has transformed the media business, as a recovering newspaper person, I can tell you it has. But these issues of the polarized and awful stuff on the internet isn't fundamentally a technology issue. It's a cultural and social and individual issue of how people, you know, people read, to some extent, people read and believe and communicate what they want to. Secondly, as I said, I think we can encourage others not in this room. You know, the parents and their responsibility and the kids, and I don't know whether people probably don't as much spend time at the dinner table as they did when we were little, but parents are the kids' first and most important teachers. And if we could work somehow to make sure that parents have the tools to give that foundational grounding for their kids, so when they show up in school, they're ready to start this process of learning how to be the next generation of citizens. And then, and here I know we'll hear a lot about tonight, is the role of schools and other civic institutions in creating a healthy marketplace of ideas. And we talked about the libraries. I'm a huge fan of the libraries, and we've been partners in a lot of the news literacy and media literacy work, and my understanding is there's another big media literacy that's going to be launched by the library associations in this fall. But you've got other civic, David Cohen from the Union League Club of Chicago the Union League Club has been trying to lead civilized convenings and conversations in Chicagoland since the Civil War. And they still are, and they're doing a great job with it. We've got the legitimate, real news media, and happily, we've still got a lot of that in Chicago, even with all the trials and tribulations. We've got two newspapers who are still slugging away. We've got other kinds of investigative groups like Dave Greising's work with the Better Government Association. Jamie Kelvin, who's up here, has a group called the Invisible Institute you'll hear from. ProPublica has come here, BEZ, TT. We're blessed with strong, legitimate institutions, but which in this day and age particularly all need our continued help. And the final thing I'd say, because it's a special interest of us at the foundation, is getting the schools further into this. Turning out the next generation of great citizens was always the core mission of schools going back 200 years, and we've lost our way a little with that. But happily in Illinois and some other states, but particularly here and also in Chicago, where the schools are beginning to do a really good job of reinvigorating their role in bringing quality civic learning back into our schools. So I'm an optimist. It's how I grew up. We've got a lot of challenges in our democracy and free speech, and is going to be part of the solution. So I'm looking forward to more speech, better speech, and the panel that you'll be hearing from reflects the best in all of us. So thank you for letting us be part of this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Hiller, for those thoughtful remarks. So before I invite the panel to come out on the stage, everyone here and in other locations, hopefully, have some paper and something to write with. We'll be collecting questions throughout the evening, and we'll be have a Q&A time for the last 15 minutes or so of the panel dialogue. And so with that, I want to invite our panel to come out onto the stage for our discussion. And this discussion is going to be led, moderated by Chicago's own media legend, Mr. Robert Jordan, yay, former WGN TV news anchor and journalist. Come on up.
Well, good evening, everyone. So nice to see you. Thank you for coming out. You know, I was telling a friend that this evening I'd be hosting a panel discussion on the First Amendment. And he said, First Amendment? And I thought, what? Are you serious? And not today. This is a topic that elicits a great response from most people. And we have this wonderful panel of some very bright individuals this evening who will be discussing this with us and discussing this topic, which, as you heard from our previous speakers, from David and others, that they're today more than ever, I think, this topic takes on quite a bit of importance. So since we are broadcasting statewide, I did want to remind students and others who are listening to us to be sure and get in your questions if you have some before this hour is up. And let's begin with an introduction of our speakers. Jeremy Biles from the School of the Art Institute. Would you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about you?
Hi, my name's Jeremy Biles. I teach at the School of the Art Institute in the Liberal Arts Department. I do mostly religion and philosophy courses.
Diana Brawley Sussman from Carbondale Public Library.
I'm the director of the Carbondale Public Library, and I'm on the Illinois Library Association board. I see them right there.
David Cohn from the Union League Club of Chicago.
Thank you, Bob. I am the Director of Public Affairs for the Union League Club of Chicago. Been there 15 years, and prior to that, spent a lot of time in government service. I call myself a survivor of Washington, D.C. and Springfield.
Colleen K. Connell.
Good evening. I'm Colleen Connell. I'm the Executive Director of the ACLU of Illinois, a lawyer and somebody who's had some experience both litigating and legislating on First Amendment issues. Good evening. Look forward to the discussion.
Right. And last but not least, Jamie Calvin.
I'm I guess a First Amendment practitioner. I'm a journalist. I have contributed to a scholarly work on the First Amendment tradition begun by my father, but most of my experience has really come in the trenches as a journalist.
So that's our wonderful panel. So let's get right into it. The first topic for this evening will be the art object. Art has often run afoul of public taste, often offending some people's modesty, patriotism, or religious beliefs. Free speech debates involving art include incidents of flag burning, the religiously motivated destruction of giant Buddhas in Afghanistan, for instance. And in 1988, at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, the protest many of you may remember, and the illegal removal of a student's painting that depicted an unflattering caricature of then-deceased Mayor Harold Washington. And that was removed from the wall. So why does art get more leeway under the law about where it can be seen than other forms of visual expression that the Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart might have called, "I know it when I see it," referring to pornography? So let's start with Colleen. Can you talk to us about art and why this is such an area that evokes so much attention?
Well, I'm going to flip I think the question a little bit on you. The law actually doesn't provide more protection for art per se. It's really starts the other way. It asks the question of whether the expression, whether it's artistic expression or other expression, is protected speech or protected expression under the First Amendment. And certain categories of material, think, for example, child pornography, are not protected by the law for, I think, what should be very obvious reasons. So to just, concretize your question a little, Bob, if you had something that was child pornography, even if the image was a photograph taken by the most talented artist around, think about Ansel Adams or someone of that level of repute, it would still be pornography if the image itself is pornographic or obscene and not protected, even again if it were artistic. But to go back and show where art has gotten the protection that it really deserves, is the court has basically said, if the expression, the artistic expression, or if the expression that's in controversy has political, artistic, social, literary value, then the First Amendment will by and large protect it. And so it's in that context we see that, for example, ultimately the Harold Washington painting that was taken off and down and then was the subject of an ACLU lawsuit was found to be protected against government action, which suppressed the speech in that instance.
But is it not still a gray area there? My parents took a photo of me when I was a baby, a naked photograph on my back, on my stomach, kind of looking at the camera and smiling. And that was sort of the vogue at the time. It wouldn't be accepted today, but why is that not considered pornographic when others are? Is it that area of we know it when we see it?
It is sort of the area of when we know it, when we see it, and I would argue, based on some ACLU litigation, that if any of us took that photo of our child today, exactly like you'd predicted, it would probably not be considered pornographic and subject you to to criminal prosecution. But there have been efforts, as I'm sure everybody has read, in the old days of film as opposed to digital images, when the local photo studio was developing those images, and when the person developing those images saw something that he or she thought was problematic, they called the police, and there were several parents who were threatened with prosecution, and in one case that the ACLU defended back in the 1980s, actually were prosecuted for something that ultimately was found not to be pornographic, and the parents were found not to have actually committed the crime of creating pornographic images.
So, what if an aesthetic symbols removal we think in terms of the Confederate flag, different speech acts. Some people value and say that these are things that are part of my heritage, and yet governments have ruled that statues have been taken away from public display in some cases. Are we in danger of encroaching on that protection at that point?
Not really, Robert. I mean, the government has protected rights to. The First Amendment doesn't protect my ability to say to the government, I think you should have this statue or that statue in your park. And the government is also given pretty broad latitude to regulate speech in certain particular situations. So, for example, in prisons, the government has a lot more latitude of regulating, for example, Confederate or other white supremacist symbolism that people who are incarcerated may try to have mailed to them or bring into or even create within the prison or institutional context. And the reason for that is the courts find that the heightened government interest, it's a compelling governmental interest in protecting the security of the correctional institution, provides sufficient reason to support that restriction on speech such that it'll survive the First Amendment scrutiny. But what the First Amendment does protect is, the right of the rest of us in most contexts to say what we want to say, to display the symbolism that we want to display, unless our display of that kind of symbolism crosses over a line and becomes a threat to public safety or security or constitutes an incitement. And as probably everybody knows, I mean, the ACLU has in some ways made a cottage industry of protecting the rights of people who want to have protests or pickets or parades to actually carry symbolism, some of which may be anathema to the people who carry their right or defend their right to carry that symbolism. Some of it we may agree with. But what the First Amendment really in so many ways is all about is protecting our right to speak or express ourselves against government regulation, except in narrow constructs.
Right, and there is something to be said for context. For example, you alluded to the removal of statues and the controversies in the South about leaders of the Confederacy being honored or presented in that way, or the display of the Confederate flag. And that's in the context of government-sponsored speech, if you will, with a statue that's paid for with public funds or displayed on public land. It would be a very different matter to discuss whether or not someone living in a southern state had the right to, for example, display a Confederate flag in a window of their home or on their front lawn, I would suspect. So context matters, and whether or not it is government-sponsored speech matters.
But yet, when you think in terms of cases where someone displaying an Al-Qaeda flag or a swastika in their yard, would that be tolerated today, or would that be considered so abhorrent that the municipality could have it removed?
Well, that's when you get into the question of whether it is inciting some kind of public unrest. I think it depends on where one displays it. The more famous cottage industry lawsuit the ACLU was involved in was defending the right of the Nazi Party to march in Skokie, famously, which I remember as a kid growing up in Deerfield. But when you have these symbols that are charged with meaning that is particularly offensive to certain groups, it's going to always engender a visceral reaction and backlash. So they may have had the right to do it, but they certainly had to withstand the venom, if you will, of the community that rose up in righteous indignation and said, we disapprove of this display.
When you think in terms of religion and France banning Muslim women from covering their faces and garb that they are wearing, is that likely to encounter the kind of repercussion that could be reversed or could be altered, or might we see that? Could that be held here in this country? Would that be protected?
The right of a person to wear a religious veil or hat is protected, and I don't see that actually being eroded by the Supreme Court. Probably at all. Again, though, context matters because the Supreme Court has upheld the right of the military to restrict the wearing, for example, of a yarmulke or the length of facial hair on people in the military under reasons that I consider unpersuasive. I don't think that the justifications that were given in my constitutional Parthenon rise to the level of compelling, but the court, as it has in a wide variety of other contexts, has granted government more latitude to regulate when government claims that the regulation is necessary because of national security or public safety reasons. And then our job really, at the ACLU and other defenders of free speech is really to try to show that the government's reasons aren't as compelling as they really proclaim, or that there is a way to regulate to protect that public safety interest in a narrower way that limits less speech.
Can I ask a question? I just
Yes.
follow up on
Jeremy?
that. I'm just wondering, and this is for Colleen, but for anyone really. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, and I'm thinking back both about the question regarding art, but also the kind of baby photo that you mentioned in pornography. The difference between pornography and obscenity, where those overlap, how to distinguish them, and how one kind of navigates that in the realm of art.
So that's an impossible question to answer.
But you know it when you see it.
And that's exactly right. As David says, the quote that Robert opened with was really came out of a pornography/obscenity case. The sort of easy rule of thumb, to the extent that there's easy, if the court has decided that it's obscene, that means basically that the court has decided that it is not protected by the First Amendment, because the First Amendment does not protect obscene material. How to define obscene is, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And one of the little historical facts is that for a period of time in the 1960s, when a number of these pornography and obscenity cases were coming in front of the court the justices of the court actually are rumored to have actually viewed some of the films sort of firsthand so that they could refine their definition of what was merely pornographic and what was obscene.
And does intent
Jamie
have anything?
probably has a lot more to say about that.
Well, I think the most striking thing about that question is it comes out of a time capsule. I mean, the reality is that the tides of social change, for better or worse, and technological change have completely swamped that distinction. Yeah. It has no bearing,
Right.
no effective operative bearing in the law.
Looking at freedom of expression in academic contexts, I'm sure you've seen examples of freedom of expression and its limits at the university level, on the sides behind and showing controversial campus speakers and the arguments, the demonstrations, the protests that have erupted at universities around the country when certain speakers have been invited to the campus. We have also two other academic partners here, Southern Illinois University at Carbondale and Shawnee Community College. They are live streaming in Southern Illinois for an audience including many high school students. So let's explore how the education and the world handles the First Amendment challenges. What is the value of freedom of speech or expression in the classroom? Why is it important to allow for freedom of expression in academic settings? We'll start off with Jeremy on that one.
Yeah, thanks. I've been thinking about this a bit, and I thought about this a little bit on the walk from my campus at the School of the Art Institute down here earlier this evening, and I was recalling a college experience I had. I took a speech class where we at least supposedly learned how to deliver public speeches, and we talked about freedom of speech and expression in various ways. And I remember I was doing a pretty middling job in that class, not doing real well, and I needed to kind of amp things up a bit. And so for the final presentation in that class, I did a presentation on the benefits of bodybuilding. And so I went through a pretty rote kind of, speech to the class about, helps you stay in shape, it can boost self-confidence, et cetera. But then at the end, I kind of took off my shirt and I tore off my undershirt, kind of Hulk Hogan style, and did a pose down for the class so they could witness firsthand the benefits of bodybuilding. And I thought about doing something along those lines for tonight, since I represent an art school, and then thought I'd spare everyone that. But I do think that this idea, taking off one's shirt, et cetera, it raises, I think, an interesting and important point, which is, I think freedom of expression, freedom of speech in the classroom, the main value of that has to do with exposure, and I think exposure in a kind of double sense. I think, one, it's about exposure to other ideas, and so cultivating in the classroom, if you're a teacher, a sense of kind of shared trust and responsibility among the students and the teacher, so that ideas can be forthcoming and students are exposed to ideas that they're unfamiliar with, ideas, histories, ideologies from psychology, philosophy, from whatever, right? From all different areas, all different disciplines, fields of inquiry. So I think there's exposure to other ideas. And then I think there's also, an important kind of element of self-exposure in the classroom as well. Not literal self-exposure as with the bodybuilding speech, but exposure of one's ideas for scrutiny by other people. And so this is where you get, I think, into the importance of critique, of criticism, of willingness, a cultivation to expose oneself, one's ideas, whether it's scholarly, academic kind of work, whether it's artwork, whatever, to the scrutiny of others, opening oneself up for critique. So exposure both to other ideas and as of oneself, one's own ideas, for kind of public or at least classroom scrutiny.
Are you saying then that because it's the School of the Art Institute or an endeavor where art is the main focus, that you are allowed more latitude?
I don't know about more, but I do feel like, I think it's important to have a very kind of capacious understanding of what constitutes freedom of expression, free speech. And in the classroom, or at least the classrooms I am in, we have pretty wide boundaries for what can happen in the classroom. I don't know about wider, but I would say that I think in general, in terms of classroom discourse, kind of a wide latitude for freedom of expression is important.
I guess what I'm saying is you standing up and ripping off your shirt in an art class would not receive the same response as if you had done that in a physics class.
Right, and to be clear, this was not an art class that I did that in. It was a speech class, and so part of what I think that maybe helps gesture toward is kind of the issue of transgression of boundaries, right? So in that case, like if you do that at the School of the Arts, that's not a biggie, right? People take off their shirt. It's just not a big deal. But in a speech class in this small Midwestern liberal arts school that I was attending at the time many years ago, I think it had a much different kind of effect, and it did actually cross some boundaries, or at least challenge some boundaries.
What about that idea of latitude and surroundings and intent? Are those all elements that at all can affect whether something is protected or not?
Yes, and I think it's probably important to sort of expand on Jeremy's concept of boundaries. I think that there are all sorts of restrictions on speech that have nothing to do with government action and don't really then implicate the First Amendment, because you need government action really to implicate the First Amendment, but that really do restrict speech in profound ways. And for me, that underscores the real importance of academic freedom, that we cherish that concept and that we protect the need for broad exposure to new ideas and different ideas against the pressures, for example, that might come from the Board of Trustees in a private liberal arts college, or as we've had, unfortunately, too many recent examples, the Board of Trustees by the University of Illinois, as they've reacted negatively to the speech of certain professors on issues that are politically sensitive or provocative. And so I think it's really clear, it's really important that we stand up for the value of academic freedom, whether it's in a public institution where the First Amendment is implicated, or whether it's in a private institution where the government is not implicated, but where there are real strong pressures sometimes to suppress different ideas or controversial ideas.
So, following on that, I think that distinction between government action and how we organize institutions that we have autonomous control in. So, academic freedom is something that we have the capacity to determine, to shape, to, in an individual classroom, as a teacher or a participant in a classroom, to decide on the conditions that will allow people to flourish intellectually, to be exposed to new ideas, to engage. And I think, and maybe that's what's happening on campuses now. I don't feel directly in touch. But campuses can be a kind of laboratory for freedom of speech without the constraints of government. And looking at different forms of internal regulation. What are the ground rules for us to have a productive conversation, for us to have a productive argument? The fundamental democratic skill to be able to argue with each other, something we seem to have lost the knack for. Campuses are, just critical, as are libraries, to that's critical ground for maintaining those values, building those traditions. And I do feel that one of the things that we should be concerned about is, and it's not just a campus phenomena, but it's really significantly a campus phenomena, is I think there are a generation, and maybe a couple of generations now, of young people who increasingly feel, or a significant subset of them, that the First Amendment is a tool of the power structure. Right. And the loss of that sort of acculturation into the First Amendment tradition, I think, should be a matter of grave concern, and particularly on campuses.
I think that this question is probably one of the more critical issues that we're going to address tonight, particularly regarding free speech and freedom to express ideas in the context of a university campus. Some of this has to do, I think, with the lack of civic education, frankly, and familiarity with some of these American traditions, such as are enshrined in the Bill of Rights, certainly the First Amendment. But the university system, in my view, does a profound disservice to students today by limiting their ability to hear viewpoints or arguments with which they may disagree or with which they may take offense. I think that is a very, and just to be clear, I mean, politically, I grew up in a household, my parents were both somewhat liberal Democrats. I worked for that now extinct species known as the moderate Republican member of Congress. And we had debates all the time about, for example, we talked about amendments coming to the House floor to ban flag burning. And there were those who felt very passionately that ought to be prohibited. And we ought to enact, perhaps amend the Constitution if necessary to prevent that. But when it comes to college campuses, it is, to me, my experience at the university level, and I think this is what most students would like to have, is an opportunity to develop the critical faculties, the capability to confront ideologies and arguments and ideas that may be offensive or that may be poorly structured, and to take them on intellectually and ideologically, not to reject them and to say, we don't want to hear what you have to say. That, to me, is the death of the modern university system. We saw a recent example in the news, I think, of a university that handled this quite well. Northeastern Illinois University had a very controversial program where they invited Sean Spicer, who was President Trump's inaugural press secretary, God help him, and Donna Brazile talking about presidential politics. There was a large backlash against having Sean Spicer on campus, and the university's response was not to cancel the program, but to give those who disagree or who felt that his appearance was inappropriate to have their own forum and to speak out about that. So I felt that that was the correct response, not simply to shut out ideas with which we disagree, but to confront them head on, much as the Jews in Skokie confronted the Nazis.
And to continue along that same line, when you think in terms of part-time, untenured adjunct professors and their abilities to speak out and to support the kind of programs that you mentioned, as opposed to those who are tenured, what is the problem that they're going to face, and their abilities for not being fearful and speaking out, not having the ability to be tenured?
Lack of protection and lack of employment.
Right.
Yeah. Obviously, there are some, just as someone mentioned, we were talking earlier about the military, and the fact that you don't waive your rights as a citizen when you enter the military, but you do have them somewhat tempered by the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You become subject to a certain command structure when you enlist in the U.S. military that gives your employer the right to constrain in certain contexts the way you speak or to whom you speak, or what you can or cannot wear as part of your uniform. So there are different gradations of protection. Certainly that's the case on a university campus. Tenured professors have that protection because they are supposed to be able to speak and write what they think. Right?
But let's stay with that for a minute and think about what a strange circumstance that is when that young professor is being charged with cultivating a sense of intellectual freedom in the students that he or she is responsible to, and are themselves afraid to speak out on public issues on campus. Some of you know, I'm an investigative reporter and have in recent years written a lot about police abuse in Chicago, have had sources in law enforcement, whistleblower cops, subject to incredible eviscerating retaliation for sharing information, for speaking out. Sources in the gang sector and part of the society as well. The people who I have engaged with as sources who have been most afraid of the consequences of speaking out have been academics. I did a story some years ago, did some research some years ago on the emergency room at the University of Chicago at a time when the administration was really trying to restrict access, and it was sort of in the early stages of what became the trauma center controversy, on the South Side. And these doctors, emergency room doctors, were more frightened as sources because of the consequences of speaking out on what was, by any measure, an important public issue that they had relevant knowledge of. So I think, that should be very concerning to us on college campuses.
I don't know how we get around that, but you saw the response from our audience. It is something that many people feel is a weakness in our system that prohibits new and untenured and part-time faculty from being in a position of security.
There's also a trend in public universities, particularly to get rid of tenure because of budgeting reasons with austerity. And so that creates a greater risk of restricting free speech because they will fear for their jobs.
Yeah. And I think, we'll talk about this in the course of the conversation with respect to journalism. We talk about government censorship, the government imposing restrictions on speech. It happens. It's a matter of concern. But overwhelmingly, the thing we should be worried about is self-censorship. And self-censorship can be induced by government action, ambiguous laws, governmental hostility to speech can induce people to censor themselves. And one of the sort of sociological insights in the law is that when people censor themselves, they almost invariably concede more than actual censorship would have extracted from them. You try to have a buffer zone that protects you. But that notion of self-censorship cuts through all sorts of things. The economic distress in journalism, the economic distress, in academia that you're referring to, your job security is at stake. That's an inducement to self-censorship. Some of the cultural tendencies, both on the left and on the right, in terms of fake news, hocus pocus on one end, and sort of canceling culture on the other, those are inducements to think twice before you speak. And I think that's an important framing of the question, because it cuts across a lot of different dimensions of our conversation, a lot of different sectors. And so the issue becomes, how do we, as a society, within our institutions, and with our own practice as individuals, create the conditions to think our own thoughts and to utter things that we believe are important to be heard. And I would argue that we're not doing really great at that as a society at the moment.
And I'd like to ask you also to take a shot at this. When we're looking at academic settings and some of the changes that have taken place over the years with respect to safe spaces and political correctness and that sort of thing, are these now new challenges, or is this a variation on a theme of challenges that have always existed?
So I have two very competing reactions that I haven't sorted out myself, so I'm just going to leave you confused. But the one is that universities are safe places, safe spaces. That's what they are, relative to the, political scrum and of the rest of society. Universities are safe places. At the same time, I feel like we have substantially failed to listen and respectfully listen and engage with some of the arguments that young people are bringing on campuses. And they feel, in my experience, feel condescended to, patronized, not heard. And so, I think what we should be thinking about is not one point of view vanquishing another point of view about these issues that are real issues. I mean, the resurgence of the question of hate speech, which was first dealt with in the law after the Second World War, and most European countries have adopted hate speech regulation. The resurgence of that in our time, with the question being brought mostly by young people in campus settings, in a whole new technological universe that we're all trying to make sense of, I think we should be concerned above all about the quality of the argument. And I don't think we're meeting the students where we might. So on one hand, I really think universities are safe spaces, and we should, honor that and hold on to that notion. But within that safe space, the authorities, the elders, the tenured professors need to be available to that argument in a much more engaged and respectful way than they have been.
Jeremy, any thoughts on political correctness today in academic settings, and how has that changed?
Right, yeah, I mean, to go back to kind of link a couple of these points, so I'm in a tenure track position right now, but I'm not tenured, not yet. I spent something like 15 years as a part-time faculty member working as an adjunct in various places, so very much familiar with the plight of the academic precariat. And I will say that the anxiety around speech and the worry over having to maintain a kind of self-censorship is a very real thing. And I'm telling you that as someone who right now is experiencing huge anxiety by virtue of the fact that I'm sitting here talking about free speech and worried about what kind of ramifications that could have for me professionally. I think that with regard to the question of safe spaces and such, I do think there are changes in the wider culture and in academic culture that are effectively infantilizing students, whereas I feel like we should recognize college students as adults and help them toward adultification rather than infantilization. I think that's the...
Yeah. I would strongly agree with that. I think there are instances where universities, again, in my view, do a disservice to their students by restricting the kinds of arguments or the kinds of speakers, the kinds of ideas that they might encounter. In the broader real world, quote unquote, they're going to encounter those things, and they need to be prepared to deal with them. Universities, to the extent possible, need to provide an environment where competing ideas and ideologies can be openly discussed and supported or defeated on their merits. Now, of course, there is with hate speech, speech is just intended to demean or provoke or that serves no intellectual purpose other than to attack someone else. Then I think you have a stronger argument for trying to exclude that kind of discussion from a university environment. But when we go to a college or university campus, at least when I went there, went to university as a student, I wanted to learn about things that I did not know about and aspects of the world, aspects of history, aspects of human culture of which I was ignorant, and to become hopefully a better and more critical thinker as a result. So I think it's an ongoing balancing act, but if we come down on the side of free speech, I think that we do our nation and indeed our culture an intellectual service by doing that.
Diana, as a librarian, are you facing any different pressures today that you didn't earlier in your career with respect to the types of books that you bring into the library and those which may spark criticism by one group as opposed to criticism or being lauded on the parts of others? How do you address that?
I think that it doesn't happen as much with books as it does with programming. So I'd say that libraries have a dual focus right now in history, particularly public libraries and academic libraries to some extent as well, where the collection and the public programming go hand in hand. And so with books have nuance to them. So divisive language happens on Twitter, where you can only say a sentence or two. Divisiveness is not as much an issue with books in a public library setting, because a book is a nuanced thing. It's a nuanced argument. It's got the breadth to it because of its length. You do see that to some extent with books, I'd say particularly in school libraries. But I'd say that where the real controversy, where the real heated stuff happens is with programming. So you've got public libraries that have done drag queen story time, for example, and it will just tear that community apart with a fierce argument, with people being very vocal against it, and then hundreds of people showing up in droves in support of the library for going through with it. So that's where I really see a lot of controversy happening is what you promote in terms of things that are happening in your community, what you put the word out about, and what you allow to take, the conversations that you allow to take place in your library. That's where I see a lot of the controversy. Not that banned books, not that that doesn't happen, it certainly does. My library has not ever seen a book get challenged to the point of being brought to the board. I think that we're pretty unique in that way. When we do.
But it does happen. There are communities where it has happened.
There are communities where it happens pretty frequently, and particularly in school libraries, but yes, there are communities where it happens pretty frequently. For my library, you would come and talk to the director. That would be the first step where they would send you, and then I'll tell you how famous you'll become. And how many people will want to read that book. Since we've not had anybody bring that to the board in our board's memory, we'll have first you and I will have a conversation about free speech. And so far, I've never had somebody who couldn't be talked out of it. Once they realized that they just asked to ban a book, and they didn't even usually realize that that's what they were asking for when they come to question the existence or placement of a book. So we first talk about freedom of speech, and usually right away they go, oh, I didn't even realize what I had just, asked you to do. No, don't do that. So, but the book, if it were to go through to that extent, would be in really, really high demand. So if your goal in asking for censorship of a book is to remove it so that people don't read it, well, you're going to shine a really big spotlight on it.
It's a great career. It's a great career move for writers.
Yeah, it is. Yes, it'll make a book very, very popular.
Bob, if I can just jump in real quickly and connect a couple of thoughts, and this really goes to David's point in part about the value of civic education, and civic education that embodies, quite frankly, the values that underlie the First Amendment. One of the more disturbing trends that I think that we have seen develop because of this lack of real civic education is the fact that we have moved from, in some ways, the First Amendment value of respecting the right of other people to have ideas, to publish ideas that we might not agree with, but respecting that. And we've almost moved, and I think the library banned book context is the perfect example of it, where it's not only that we don't want to read it or do it, but we don't want anybody else to do it either. And that is so very, very dangerous, and really does, I think, completely disregard the value of free expression that underlies the First Amendment, and really I think cries out for more forums like this, and really a public embrace of why freedom of expression is so important for a democracy.
Well, the other aspect of that, too, is to think about the fact that, right now we've talked about universities, we've talked about libraries, we've talked about situations where there is some government control. If you work for a public university, you are publicly funded, so therefore those government free speech applies. If you work for a public library, you're a government entity. So we don't have the ability, we are restricted as far as not restricting free speech, right? But where we really have a gray area is where what most of our discussions, most of our civic engagement in the world today is online. And so that's under the purview of a corporation, or two or three.
Right.
And so they have no, the First Amendment does not directly apply to them. And so where most of our engagement is happening is in a completely unregulated space where they can choose to make their own policies, and they can choose to make them as restrictive or not restrictive as they want to. And that seems like a very tenuous place to be, and they're international corporations. They're reaching out to the whole world. So as you said, in Europe there are very different laws around free speech, and in many other countries there are many different restrictions regarding free speech versus the U.S., where we have a little bit more of it.
Yeah, and the D.C. Circuit came out with a 200-page decision today that I've not had time to read, in which they basically...
I'm shocked.
They basically, upheld the FCC's, backtracking on the concept of net neutrality, and that will allow corporations even more authority to essentially control the speed or the access that private individuals have on the basis of whether it's advertising revenue or whether you're a big consumer or a small consumer. And I think that's a very disturbing, but in some ways private trend, but amplified by the FCC's change of heart on this.
Let me offer, you mentioned institutions that have some public connection like libraries. Let me offer an example from the private sector where I work. Union League Club of Chicago, as a private 501c7, has the absolute right to invite or not invite anyone it likes to speak. But because the club was founded to sustain these values of American democracy, including the First Amendment, We don't believe that one ceases to learn or to be challenged after you leave university level. It's something that's a lifetime experience. And so, for example, we've invited speakers and continue to invite speakers from across the ideological spectrum. We've had Karl Rove speak at the club. We had former Justice Antonin Scalia speak at the club. We also had President Bill Clinton and Mario Cuomo, the late Governor Cuomo, speak at the club. And every time that we have a speaker who has an ideological bent, if you will, there are going to be certain members of the club who will choose not to attend or who will express disapproval. Others will want to attend. But the whole idea is to have this broad spectrum of thought and ideology that we continue to consider as we hopefully grow and learn.
You know, before we run out of time, there's one area that I really think we should address, and that is social media today and some of the dangers and threats to the First Amendment that I'd like to hear from you address. When we think in terms of some of the technological advancements that have taken place, that our laws have been lagging and haven't had the time or the opportunity to have even been written to deal with some of these areas. And so I think in terms of the ability to dub in people's voices in other folks' mouths, or to address plagiarism that takes place in ways that we can't even foresee, and to have it seem as though someone is saying something that they may not even be saying at all. All of these areas that we haven't even addressed yet that may put the First Amendment under pressure. So I'd like to hear from you, if we could, with your thoughts about that, first of all, to give us some ideas of how do we deal with this brave new world of the internet and publication and the ability to speak.
I think we're in the early stages of trying to make sense of it, as I think most of us are in our personal lives, right? I mean, we're in very swift trajectory in historical time. You know, the means of communication have dramatically changed around us. You know, as we've alluded to several times in the course of this conversation, the First Amendment is fundamentally addressed to government action vis-a-vis speech. You know, in one sense, you could ask, is that construct really obsolete given what has now is beyond any single nation, is transnational? You know, the means of communication have, I think, created a whole new context for addressing these questions, and we're not going to sort them out tonight.
Right.
I hope I'm not disappointing anybody. But I do think that I want to loop this piece of the conversation back to something we were talking about in the context of the libraries, which is that we've tended to talk in this conversation, many other conversations of this nature that I've been in the course of my career, as if First Amendment controversies, as if controversies over freedom of speech are negative events, as if this is a breakdown of something, as if this should be it should be seen as sort of regrettable. We've also talked about civic education in the course of the evening. I would argue that First Amendment controversies and the ongoing argument about social media and whatever comes next are fundamentally central to civic education, to acculturation into the First Amendment tradition. I alluded earlier, my dad was a First Amendment scholar, and he died young, and I finished a book he was working on, a very big book. And it was literally a first draft, and so there was penciled marginalia throughout the book that sort of guided my revisions. And on the back side of a page opposite, some text about Hugo Black, who was celebrated as an absolutist. You know, do not abridge means do not abridge, and was really an admirable justice in so many ways, who kept his bearings when other people were losing theirs. And so my dad wrote, you know, that I can almost remember this exactly in his scrawled pencil strokes, that his absolutism is a sad flaw amidst so much gallantry, giving Black his props. And as for my own view, I think freedom of speech is almost an absolute. But that means it has to be won by sweat, case by case, again and again. And that notion of almost an absolute, I mean, in truth, the history of freedom of speech is the history of regulation. You only have a principle when you define its parameters. So we're always, trying to figure out what those parameters should be. I would urge on you the idea of almost an absolute, because it means you have to keep going back, you have to keep engaging, you have to keep listening to the argument for censorship. You have to keep honoring the counter values and taking them seriously. And I think if we do that as a society, when we look up, we realize we've been engaged in a discipline of freedom. This is what freedom is. It's that dialectic. And, it's kind of fundamentalism to have an orthodoxy about speech that answers all questions. Right.
And so I'd like for you to address that, Colleen, just to briefly.
So I'm just going to follow up on what Jamie and I were actually talking about. I think his construct is quite profound, almost an absolute, and the need for continued engagement on these issues is also an almost absolute imperative, because so many times the conflicts that we're discussing really involve tensions between the First Amendment's right of expression and other constitutional values or other constitutional rights. One of the contexts in which I have spent a great deal of my professional career is protecting women's reproductive freedom. And the tension between meaningful access of a woman, meaningful private access of a woman to her physician or to an abortion clinic is in tension with the First Amendment rights of protesters. And at what point does their protected speech to oppose this right become in some ways regulable, because they have by their words or actions and sort of transgressed into violating the woman's privacy or perhaps her physical safety. And so I think that this continued dialogue on what regulations are we going to allow of a near absolute right are fundamental for the health of our democracy and for the protection of the entire panoply of rights that are protected by the Constitution.
Bob, if I could just say one quick thing about the social media, the relatively unregulated internet and its ability to manipulate and influence human thought. We've gone through this kind of evolutionary change before. If you remember when Orson Welles broadcast War of the Worlds, it engendered fear and panic among a populace for this relatively new medium of radio, and they weren't quite sure how to evaluate it, and they assumed that what they were hearing was actually going on. Similarly, I think that we're in a kind of a generational and societal evolution with the internet and with digital media to attain a degree of digital literacy that will enable us to be able to filter out the sources of things that we see on the internet so that we all become our own Snopes, for example. And I think that's an important thing to recognize, that with the emergence of every new medium of human communication, there is always this tremendous break where the rules that used to apply and our understanding of how things were supposed to work are suddenly destroyed before our very eyes. So we need to, as a society and globally, frankly, develop this new sense of digital literacy to confront that.
Thank you, David. I wanted to get in just a couple of questions, if we could, since we do have an audience downstate. We have Natasha from Carbondale High School who asks, and this is here talking about freedom of expression. How do school dress codes impact the individual, and how does that fall under freedom of expression? Want to tackle that one,
Yeah,
Colleen?
quickly. I think that schools are, to state the obvious, one of those institutional contexts, particularly in a public school. And in a private school, the First Amendment doesn't apply, in which school administrators have used, inconsistent with this. It comes from an old case, Tinker versus Des Moines Public Schools. Basically they'll say that we have to have this dress code because it's important for student safety. We don't want students wearing gang colors or gang symbolism. Or we have to ban spandex and leggings because it'll be a distraction that'll distract from the pedagogical purpose of the school. I think that oftentimes those rationale are not persuasive. They're used to impose much more regulation than really is necessary. But courts have, by and large, upheld the rights of public schools to set dress codes. We continue to get lots of calls about them every September.
I'm sure you do. And this is for you. This is from Cindy. Cindy Nelson at SIU. How do libraries decide on what is an appropriate book to include?
It depends on the library. So local control is, it's absolutely essential to libraries. It's written into how we are governed. And so there are a couple of different ways to build your library, and some of those depend largely on space constraints. So at my library, Carbondale Public Library is a small to medium-sized library, and we don't have a whole lot of space. So we're a popular reading model. So we are building a collection based on what is in high demand. Rather than an archival library, which is a library that is attempting to build a collection that sort of memorializes culture, and they tend to need more space in order to keep all of those books. So at our library, we choose books based on popularity, but also in trying to make sure that you are covering every topic that somebody could possibly want to read. And we also subscribe to something called Automatically Yours, which is through one of our book providers, Baker & Taylor, where we buy a lot of books, where they automatically give us some bestsellers that everybody's going to want. That way it takes a little bit of the human being out of it, our own perhaps subconscious tendencies to censor and to not buy something that we don't agree with. It'll automatically come if it's popular enough. So that takes a little bit out of that. And then we, at our library, everyone who does collection development, who purchases materials, is someone who has been to library school. And so they're really schooled in the First Amendment. So that's a priority when we are making our selections.
Okay, thank you. Final question is for you, Jamie, and you may or may not know that Jamie Kelvin was instrumental in filing the FOID that helped to have the Laquan McDonald video released, which had been held by the city administration, Rahm Emanuel and the police department. Both kind of sat on that for a while and refused to let that, and Jamie was able to get that released. And in light of that, we have a question asking, the release of police videos where there is an overwhelming public interest. Is it in the public right of access of those records to, or are those records, is it right to have them protected, or is there a right to have them released?
Well, first a slight correction. I broke the Laquan McDonald story in reporting on it, making known the existence of the video. It was others who filed the lawsuit that resulted in its release. I think we've established, and again, it's a really positive First Amendment open government story. We've established in Chicago, in Cook County, in Illinois, a level of transparency with respect to precisely this kind of public information that is pretty much without parallel in the country. There's no other state with a major urban police department that has the same level of transparency. It remains a somewhat gray area where I've reported in the last week on an instance where the police department made selective release of video in connection with a police shooting that the video they released served to support the police narrative of what happened, while other video was withheld until, again, there was a court order to release it. And yet other video was, I think more through incompetence than suppression, was lost until we identified its existence. But this has been a huge driver of the national discourse on police reform. And it's something to celebrate in Chicago. And there's still, there's still work to do in refining the laws and regulations governing the release of this evidence. But I think it's pretty much an irreversible momentum now. That this is public information that is available to the public.
And we'd like to thank you all for coming out this evening. And as you can understand, we have just scratched the surface on a discussion of the First Amendment with all of the different attitudes and changes that have taken place today. We'd like to thank the School of the Art Institute for putting this on. Cheryl Russell, please step out. She and her staff. And I'd like to also thank our wonderful panel who've here, Jeremy Biles, Colleen Connell, Jamie Kelvin, David Koch, and Diana Sussman. Thank you all for being here this evening, and thank you for coming out.
And that concludes this evening's broadcast. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. We hope you have a great evening. Get home safe. Thank you.